Hello and welcome to another modeling video. This is Alan from the Mokonoman at YouTube with another model video. Today reviewing the Mr. Color Super Metallic Stainless Steel Metalizers. They will be in comparison to a large collection of metallics and other metalizers I have in my personal collection. All are painted via airbrush on an allotment of spoons marked out clearly. Some are thinnable with lacquer thinner, the rest pre-mixed. Exception for Molotow. In preparation, the spoons have been universally polished and painted with Mr. Metal Color GX Metallic Black. I find it to be far superior to just a high sheen gloss black. A lot easier to apply, control, and it has a nice reflective base overall. I use the same base when modeling with metallics and metalizers on plastic models. Mr. Color Super Metallic SM04 stainless steel is a box premium metalizer with the finest pigment and a nice reflective surface for its time. It was ludicrously expensive 10 years ago when available. I had to purchase in Japan during my first trip. I remember hobby shops stocking this for around the $20 mark, which was just unaffordable. We generally used pre-mixed Alclad 2 or Mole Masters acrylic or enamel. During the 90s and early 2000s, I found the paint to be very thick and syrupy. It was cut 2 part thinner, 1 part paint and applied via airbrush at 0.3 mil. At low PSI, I dusted it on in 3 very fine coats, and after 24 hours drying, I buffed it with a fine microfiber tissue. It did not give much of a sheen, though the finish seems fairly realistic, like a solid piece of metal. It's impressive-ish, but definitely not for the price paid back in the period. The original is long out of production and is considered dead stock or in the discount bins at older hobby shops or the back room. Recently, Mr. Color Super Metallic 2 has been released, and as listed on the website, it's a very finely ground metalizer pigment, watered down with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner or general Mr. Color Thinner. It is recommended not to use a top coat as it will dull. However, sourced from the Mr. Hobby website in English, information does contradict itself, as the Mr. Super Clear claims to be a sealant for metalizers and this very product. We shall test this in the future. SM204 is built to be the second generation to super metallic stainless steel, ball bearing added and thoroughly shook. It's in the standard 10mm jar with a fancier label. The retail is almost 3 times of the standard Mr. Color metallics at a little over $10. It has a thick and syrupy viscosity. Impressively, the pigment is fine enough to swirl and shimmer moving around with the liquid. It does need to be very well stirred, as it will separate quicker than other paints. It is cut the same consistency with thinner at 2 part thinner, 1 part paint, and gently airbrushed at a low PSI across 3 coats. It has a rich and complex finish with a deep shine or shimmer. If you're looking for a polished effect, it is far superior to the original. It does look like a rich, real metal, though the two almost seem like completely different colors or paints altogether. The original is a tad disappointing, though if it was cheaper to a mainline paint, thoroughly would have no problem using it as a dull metal, as you do need to use them. The number 2 as a polished metal, really like it. Did not expect such a premium product coming out of Mr. Color. I'm already a fan of their existing line of metallic paints and feel that some of the later additions are already good enough to use on fairly polished metallic looking aircraft or other subject matter in scale. I'd say that this is a fairly worthwhile buy for the finish you get out. After use thinned, you can reclaim the paint. The airbrush is cleaned and wiped down with premium generic lacquer thinner and also previously thinned with the same. Unrelated, but I wish to compare and review with what we already seen that you can potentially use or already use. Super Silver 159 is a standard line from the Mr. Color range at the standard retail. It has a chunkier pigment, it cuts with lacquer thinner 50/50 or greater, and it applies pretty well with a standard sheen on the spoon. This is good enough to use as is for most metallic applications, and even decent enough for candy effects. It is also hand paintable, where the other two are exclusively airbrush. Where Super Silver is chunky, Gun Chrome is finer and more suitable for realistic application for military or lifelike dioramas, very fine scale stuff. The Super Silver is more so science fiction-y or fantasy effect, very good for large scales. Unlike anything else from the standards range, Gun Chrome is very thick and slightly trickier to airbrush, not good to hand paint. Sometimes sold with the Aquarius acrylic range, Mr. Metal Color is a lacquer base that is designed specially for hand painting. If you dry brush, it will self-polish. Cutting it 50/50 with lacquer thinner and airbrushing it will give a dull effect. It doesn't properly or suitably dry. Buffing it with a microfiber cloth will bring out a shine, and a metalizer sealant is required. It does give a very fine pigment like the premium paints, but requires more work. Gaianotes lacquer is a little cheaper in the EX7 50ml bottle. Disappointingly, spraying it on the large surface is slightly splotchy and very thick pigments, thicker than the Mr. Color stuff. However, I've been using it successfully quite a bit for shading, highlights and candy. I've just not used it in this capacity and a little bit disappointed, unfortunately. I do love Gaianotes, but the metallics are definitely hit and miss. Cut 50/50 with lacquer thinner. I'm still very much likely will be using it as a highlight for shading metallics. Scale Model Suppliers is one of our first metalizers, pre-mixed and indigenous exclusive to Australia. Found this one to be fairly blotchy and a low pigment count. It took a few more coats to get a bit of a build-up. It's a little more expensive than its standard range and more so expensive than the product we're reviewing today. Exclusive airbrush, built to be used with candies. I find it to be fairly disappointing. Alclad 2 polished aluminium is the original pre-thinned lacquer metalizer for the hobby, exclusively used for airbrush, though I've seen people dry brush this with a great amount of success. It was expensive for the time at around $12 a bottle. It still gets a fairly good result, though the pigment density is a little bit on the thin side. It is a very soft paint where other paints and thinners can damage it and disturb it easily. It is no longer favoured anymore, though some may still use it. It may be nostalgia speaking, but I still enjoy the finish and enjoy using it if I can still find it. To the extreme end of the scale, Molotow Liquid Chrome, a very weird acrylic pseudo paint ink. It self-levels and shines to this beautiful mirror finish for all sorts of applications and recently popular in the hobby. I wanted to compare this to what the very end does look like, though also have a chance to talk about extreme use of metallics and sheens for the purpose of the scale and subject and what feels right. There is a whole plethora and different range of paints, sheens and metallics that are at your disposal. You don't necessarily have to reach for the most shiniest, as it may not be suitable for the universe or the finish you're going for, especially something that might be heavily used or could dull even if it rolls off the assembly line. Very good for a comic book, sci-fi, fancy flash thing, maybe bits on showroom cars and whatnot, but it takes a bit of maturity to deploy and utilize Molotow for the right project and the right look. It can be overused and not quite right. Use wise, you pour on your airbrush and apply straight away. Some people enjoy the marker, but that gets a bit streaky. Best to wash out with water and a little bit of alcohol. Lacquer thinner does cause it to cake and clog up. Otherwise, this is a very cool product and I don't mind using it for swords and bladed style weapons. Mirrors, lenses, very small quantities. And that is a wrap up. Metals are not quite metals, and each of them has a different look, sheen, feel to it. My go-to is collect and buy as many as you can. The right one would just feel right in your gut to pull out and spray on the part of the model that you need to. I feel a range and a library of these sort of paints is a lot more effective than just being a one-trick pony with one or two products, and it's thoroughly fun to collect. I still haven't compared this to the premium Model Master piece. There's a few other brands out there, and Zurich has a piece that I will have to spray eventually one day. If you're attempting a monochrome model with various tones and metallics, having a library is a lot of fun. Playing with candy black or shading is fantastic. I love to shade metallics. I would definitely say pick up a bottle of Super Metallic 2 and anything else from Mr. Hobby Metallic wise. It is a lot of fun to spray. It's easy enough to use by thinning it down appropriately externally from the airbrush and pouring it in. Spraying with a 0.5mm airbrush and rocking the nozzle will get far more control and less likely for the chunkier pigments to block things up. And that's all I've got really to share. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content, and we'll catch you guys later. See ya.